Education improvement is really hard. Schools are inherently conservative social system. And that's not just true in Argentina, it's true in so many places around the world. It's so much easier to educate students for our past than for their future. As parents, we get nervous when our children learn things that we don't understand, and even more when they no longer study things that were so important for us. Teachers are more comfortable to teach how they were taught than how they were taught to teach. And as a politician, you can lose an election over education issues, but you can rarely win one over education, because it takes so much more than an election cycle to translate good intentions into good results. So sometimes it seems that changing educational bureaucracies is like moving graveyards. It's hard to rely on the people out there to really help, because the status quo has so many protectors. And the biggest risk to schooling today isn't its inefficiency, but that our way of schooling is losing its purpose and relevance. And when fast gets really fast, being slow to adapt makes education systems really slow and disoriented. We live in this world in which the kind of things that are easy to teach and test have also become easy to digitize, to automate. Education has won the race with technology throughout our history. But there's no automaticity it's going to do that in the future. Students growing up with a great smartphone but a poor education are going to face unprecedented risks. But we could still assume that what we learn in school is going to last for a lifetime. Teaching content knowledge was rightly at the center of education. Today, the world no longer rewards us for what we know. Google knows everything. But for what we can do with what we know. Think about it. In the 20th century, literacy was about extracting knowledge from established sources. When you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia and you could trust the answer you find that to be true. In the 21st century, Google will give you 50,000 answers to any question. And nobody tells you what's right or wrong, what's true or not true. Literacy has become about navigating ambiguity, about distinguishing between fact and fiction, about triangulating different sources, about constructing knowledge. And people need to be able to question or seek to improve the accepted knowledge and practice of our times. If all we do is teach our children what we know, they'll remember enough to follow in our footsteps. But it's only if we help them build a reliable compass that they can go anywhere and find their way through this increasingly complex, volatile, ambiguous world. It's going to be about our capacity to learn, but also to unlearn and relearn when the context changes. The future will be about pairing the artificial intelligence of computers with the cognitive, the social, the emotional skills and values of humans. If we want to stay ahead of technological developments, we have to find and refine the qualities that are truly human and that complement, not compete with, the capacities that we've created in our computers. So one thing the artificial intelligence does, it pushes us much harder to think what makes us really human. Tomorrow's schools need to help students think for themselves and join others in work, in citizenship. They need to help students develop a strong sense of right and wrong and sensitivity to the claims that others make. At work, at home, in the community, people will need a deep understanding of how others think, whether as scientists or artists, and how others live in different cultures, in different traditions. Whatever tasks machines may be taking over from humans at work, the demands on our capabilities to contribute meaningfully to social and civic life is going to always keep rising. And that's where our current model of schooling gets to its limits. We invented schooling in the industrial age when the prevailing norms were standardization and compliance. There was a time when it was both effective and efficient to educate students in batches and train them teachers once for their entire working lives. The curricula that spelled out what students should learn were designed at the top of the pyramid, then translated into instructional material and teacher education, often through multiple layers of government, and then rolled out across classrooms. I started my career in medical research. And there, the first thing you do is take the patient's temperature and diagnose what treatment is going to be most effective. In school, we tend to give all students the same treatment. And it's only years later when they graduate that we ask ourselves whether their treatment was really effective. And the result is that many learners with different needs fall by the wayside. And why children from wealthier families will always find open doors to a successful life. Children from poor families really only have one single chance in life, and that's a good school. And if it's the wealthiest, not the brightest, who end up with the best places in education, we end up running the engine of our societies on just 2 cylinders. That's a really design flaw of our school systems. And in the end, how we treat the most vulnerable students says a lot about who we are ourselves. The other consequence is that education systems end up to be run by those who succeeded in them, while those who struggled rarely have a voice. This industrial model of schooling makes change in a fast-moving world far too slow. Even the best education minister can no longer do justice to the needs of millions of students, hundreds and thousands of teachers, and tens of thousands of schools. The challenge is to build on the expertise of teachers and school leaders and enlist them in the design of superior policy and practice. That means turning teaching into a profession of advanced knowledge workers, governed by professional norms and work organizations in lieu of bureaucratic and administrative control. One of the reasons why we don't get out of this model of education is that our thinking in education is stuck in so many myths. So I start my book with debunking those. The poor will always do badly in school. That's not true. The 10% most disadvantaged kids in Shanghai do better in math than the 10% most advantaged students here in Argentina, and in fact much of Latin America. So poverty need not be destiny. Immigrants will lower the performance of a country on international comparisons. That's not true. There's no relationship between the share of immigrants and the quality of an education system. And the school system where immigrant students settle matters a lot more than the country where they came from. Smaller classes mean better results. That's not true. In fact, whenever high-performing education systems have to make a choice between a smaller class and a better teacher, they go for the latter. In fact, often it's small classes that have contributed to the Tayloristic work organization where teachers end up doing nothing else than teaching and don't have the time for individual student support, for collaboration with other professionals, or for working with parents. That are the hallmarks of high-performing education systems. More time spent learning means better results. That's not true. Study hours in Finland are little more than half than what students in the UAE spend studying. But in Finland, students learn a lot in little time, while in the United Arab Emirates, they learn very little in a lot of time. The results of PISA are merely a reflection of culture. That's not true either. The rapidly improving education systems did not change their culture, but their educational policies and practices. Why is our thinking so much captured by myth and past practice? Because education systems have a habit of building walls that separate teachers, schools, or systems from peer learning. When I started PISA, the central idea was to break those walls. The idea was to count what counts that is to collect high-quality data on key educational outcomes, to analyze those data to empower people to make more informed decisions, and to harness collaborative power to act on the data, both by lowering the cost of political action and at times also by raising the cost of political inaction. And the good news is that our knowledge about what works in education has improved vastly. And I devote a large part of my book to what makes school systems successful. You know, the first thing I learned is that the leaders in high-performing education systems have convinced their citizens to value the future. Chinese parents and grandparents will invest their last money into their future, the education of their children. In Europe, we've already spent the money of our children for our own consumption. But valuing education highly is just part of the equation. Another part is the deep belief that every student can learn. In some education systems, students are segregated into different tracks at early ages, reflecting the notion that only some children can succeed. In contrast, in countries like Estonia, Canada, Finland, Japan, parents and teachers trust that all students can meet high standards, and that trust is manifested in the student and teacher behavior. These systems have advanced from sorting human talent to developing human talent. They realize that ordinary students can have extraordinary talents. And nowhere does the quality of a school system exceed the quality of its teachers. Top school systems select and educate their teaching staff very carefully. And they provide an environment in which teachers work together to frame good practice. And they encourage teachers to grow in their careers. Top-performing school systems have moved on from administrative control and accountability to professional forms of work organization. They encourage their teachers to be innovative, to improve their own performance and that of their colleagues, and to pursue professional development that leads to stronger practice. In top school systems, the emphasis is not on looking upwards within the administration of the school system. It's about looking outwards to the next teacher or the next school, creating a culture of collaboration and strong networks of innovation. And the best performing school systems provide high quality education across the entire system so that every student benefits from excellent teaching. To achieve that, these countries attract strongest principals to the toughest schools and the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms. And last but not least, high-performing systems tend to align policies and practices across the entire system. They ensure that the policies are coherent over sustained periods of time, and they see that they are consistently implemented. And yet, knowledge is only as valuable as our capacity to act on it. To transform schooling at scale, we need not just a radical vision of what is possible, but also very smart strategies that actually make change happen. The road of education reform is littered with good ideas that were poorly implemented. The laws, regulations, structures, and institutions on which education leaders tend to focus are just like the small visible tip of the huge iceberg. And the reason why it's so hard to move school systems forward is that there is a much larger invisible part under the waterline. And this invisible part is about the interests, the beliefs, the motivations, and the fears of the people who are involved in education, parents and teachers included. This is where the unexpected collisions occur, because this part of education reform tends to evade the radar screen of public policy. That's why education leaders are rarely successful with reform unless they build a shared understanding and collective ownership for change. And unless they build capacity and create the right policy climate with accountability measures designed to encourage innovation rather than compliance. We demand a lot from our teachers, not just in Argentina, but everywhere. We expect them to have a deep and broad understanding of what they teach and whom they teach. Because what teachers know and care about makes such a difference to student learning. That entails professional knowledge, such as knowledge about a discipline, knowledge about the curriculum of that discipline, and knowledge about how students learn in that discipline. It includes knowledge about professional practice, so teachers can create a kind of learning environment that leads to good learning outcomes. And it involves inquiry and research skills that help teachers to be lifelong learners and grow in their profession. Students are unlikely to become lifelong learners if they don't see their teachers as lifelong learners. But we expect much more from our teachers than what appears in their job description. We also expect them to be passionate, compassionate, thoughtful, to encourage students' engagement and responsibility, to respond to students from different backgrounds with different needs, and to promote tolerance and social cohesion. To provide continual assessments of students and feedback to ensure that students feel valued and included, and to encourage collaborative learning. And we expect teachers themselves to collaborate and work in teams and with other schools and with parents to set common goals and plan and monitor the attainment of those goals. And most people remember at least one of their teachers who took a real interest in their life and their aspirations, who helped them understand who they are and discover their passions, and who taught them how to love to learn. Attracting, developing, and retaining capable teachers and ensuring that every student benefits from excellent teaching remains an immense challenge. What shapes the pool from which countries can select their teachers is a combination of the social status associated with the job, the contributions a candidate feels or she can make while in the job, and the extent to which the work is financially and intellectually rewarding. While it's relatively easy to make teaching more financially attractive, you can just raise salaries, it's much harder to make teaching more intellectually attractive. But it's the latter that is the key to attracting highly talented people into the profession. Particularly as many people who go into teaching do so to make a difference to their society. It's hard because it depends on how the work of teachers is organized, the opportunities teachers have for professional growth, and how their work is regarded in the profession and by society at large. But rather than wait for a new generation of teachers, we need to invest more in the existing schools and teachers, enlisting their commitment to reform and supporting their improvement. Teachers in Singapore are entitled to 100 hours of professional development per year to stay up to date in their field and to improve their practice. And the key is often not just a large amount of class taking by serving teachers, it is the underlying career structures and how they interrelate with the time teachers work together in a form of social organization that both requires and provides new knowledge and skills that make the difference. Successful programs encourage the development of teachers' learning communities through which teachers can share their expertise and their experiences. There's growing interest in ways to build cumulative knowledge across the profession. For example, by strengthening connections between research and practice, encouraging schools to develop as learning organizations. I show in the book that professional development activities that have an impact on teachers' instructional practices are those that take place in schools and allow teachers to work in collaborative groups. Teachers who work with a high degree of professional autonomy and at the same time in a collaborative culture, characterized by high levels of both cooperation and instructional leadership. Those teachers say that they participate much more in school professional development activities and that those activities have a much greater impact on their teaching. Successful education systems will also do whatever it takes to develop ownership of professional practice by the teaching profession. Some argue one cannot give teachers and education leaders greater autonomy because they lack the capacity and expertise to deliver on it. And of course, that often holds some truth. But a response that simply perpetuates a prescriptive industrial model of teaching will continue to disengage teachers. Like someone who was trained to heat up pre-cooked hamburgers is going to rarely become a master chef. In contrast, productive learning takes place when teachers feel a sense of ownership over their classrooms and students feel a sense of ownership over their learning. So the answer is to strengthen trust, transparency, professional autonomy, and the collaborative culture of the profession all at the same time. But the most essential reason why teachers' ownership of the profession is a must-have, rather than an optional extra, lies in the pace of change in the 21st century. Even the most effective attempts to translate a government-established curriculum into classroom practice will drag out over a decade, because it takes so long to communicate the goals and methods through the different layers of the school system and to build them into traditional methods of teacher education. In a fast-changing world, when what and how students need to learn changes so rapidly, such a slow process is no longer good enough because it inevitably leads to a widening gap between what students need to learn and what and how teachers teach. The only way to shorten that pipeline is to professionalize teaching. That is to ensure that teachers not only have a deep understanding of the curriculum as a product, but equally with the process of curriculum and the instructional design and the pedagogies to enact and enable the ideas that are behind the curriculum. The challenge is to build on the expertise of the teachers and school leaders and to enlist them in the design of superior policies and practices. Where systems fail to engage teachers in the design of change, teachers will rarely help systems in the implementation of change. While governments can establish directions and curriculum goals, the teaching profession needs to take charge of the instructional system, and governments need to find ways to enable and support professionalism. However, increased professional autonomy also implies challenging idiosyncratic practice. It means moving away from every teacher having their own approach towards the common use of practice to actually use practice that are agreed as effective, making teaching not just an art, but also more of a science. Paradoxically, the highly standardized industrial work organization of teaching has often left teachers alone in the classroom. 0% school autonomy has meant 100% teacher isolation behind closed classroom doors. Changing that will hinge on effective leadership. Effective leadership is central to virtually every aspect of education, and most importantly, so when there is little coherence and capacity in education. There are many great teachers, schools, and educational programs in every education system. But it takes effective leadership to build a great education system. Last but not least, educational leaders need not look just forward, but also outwards. And that's not about copying and pasting solutions from other places. It's about looking seriously and dispassionately at good practice in our own countries and elsewhere to understand what works in what context. School systems that feel threatened by alternative ways of thinking, they get trapped in old practice. The ones that progress are those that are open to the world and ready to learn from and with the world's education leaders. It's a tough agenda, but we don't need to be passive. True, technological change and globalization have disruptive implications for our economic and social structure, but they don't have predetermined implications. It's the nature of our collective responses to those disruptions that determines their outcomes. It's the interplay between the technological frontier and the cultural, social, and institutional and economic agents that we mobilize in response. I decided to write this book when I saw children from the poorest neighborhoods of Shanghai learning from Shanghai's best teachers. That's the moment when I realized that universal high-quality education is an attainable goal, and that our task is not to make the impossible possible, but to make the possible attainable. It's entirely within our means to deliver a future for millions of learners who currently don't have one.